Our first reading is from the book of Luke, it's chapter 22, verse 39 to 46. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you do not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down, and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like the drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to his disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation."
We join Jesus the night before his death. He's had the Last Supper, and we're told he goes out, verse 39, with his disciples to the Mount of Olives. And in this episode, we get an insight into the anguish that Jesus is going through, as well as the depth of his relationship with his Father. Do you notice how his anguish is described in verse 44? And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. So much so, he requires the assistance of an angel to strengthen him. What is the cause of this anguish? Well, it seems to be centered around this cup that he mentions and that he pleads with his Father could be taken away from him. This cup is so significant, such a cause of anguish, that Jesus asks if there is any way that it could be removed. What is this cup? Well, a number of times in the Old Testament, the cup is used as the imagery of the cup of wrath, to speak of the fury and the anger and the terror of God's judgment. Here in this cup is God's perfect and holy hatred of sin. Here is what Jesus is to taste on the cross. And so it is this thought that causes anguish to the point of sweat like drops of blood falling to the ground. What does Jesus choose to do then the night before his death? Jesus knows what is coming. Jesus knows what it will involve. Jesus knows what his path looks like. And so he falls to his knees and prays to his Father. Verse 42. "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me." And yet Jesus' highest priority is total submission and obedience to the will of the Father. "Yet not my will, but yours be done." What a wonderful obedience. In Jesus' time of greatest need, what does he do? He turns to his Father in heaven. And he knows that this is also what his disciples there and what every disciple since needs. Verse 40, on reaching the place, he said to them, his disciples, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." Verse 46, "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation." Jesus depends on his Father. Jesus submits to his Father. Jesus calls his disciples and us to depend on our Father in prayer when we face temptation. And wonderfully, when we might fall to temptation, thank God that Jesus never did.
We continue to read from Luke's Gospel 22, from verse 47. While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour, when darkness reigns."
Just as Jesus finishes praying, and we're told while he is even still speaking, he is approached and betrayed by one of his own. In the passage just read out, Jesus asks two questions in verses 48 and 52. And yet questions with quite a different feel to them. Jesus' question of Judas in verse 48 seems less one of clarification. Jesus knows Judas is going to betray him. He's already spoken about it earlier in this chapter. It more seems that Jesus is wanting to emphasize the enormity of what Judas is about to do, and maybe even offer him one final opportunity to reconsider. The question to the chief priests and the officers of the guard and the elders in verse 52 feels more of a challenge and a rebuke. They really need swords and clubs to arrest him. He's been present with them in the temple courts and they've done nothing. But Jesus says he's not there to put up a fight. Even as one of his disciples, identified as Peter in John's account, lashes out, so Jesus puts a stop to any violence, offering healing to the servant of the high priest, part of the gang who's come to arrest him. No, Jesus' ultimate victory will not be won by swords, but by sacrifice. Yes, victory will come. But for now, Luke tells us that Jesus highlights who or what is reigning. Because here is the darkness of Easter, verse 53. But this is your hour when darkness reigns. Darkness in the Bible is a picture of evil and of the judgment of God. Jesus spoke about people's love for darkness in John chapter 3. He says, people love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. I guess at its simplest, darkness is uncomfortable. It's literally blinding. It's confusing. It's disorienting. And yet, given a deeper meaning, darkness is evil. Here, as the Son of God is betrayed by one of his closest, as he's arrested by those he came to save, here is when darkness reigns.
The next reading is from Luke chapter 22, verse 54 to 62. Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly, this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you are talking about." Jesus, as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly.
We move from one disciple to another, from Judas to Peter. Peter, the bold, brash disciple who confidently tells Jesus he will never disown him. But back in verse 33 says he is ready to go with Jesus to prison and to death. Here he does follow Jesus, but at a distance. Close enough to follow what's going on, but far enough back not to be caught up in it, I guess. While Jesus finds himself in the court of the high priest, Peter finds himself in the courtyard outside. While Jesus is getting questioned by the high priest, Peter finds himself questioned by a servant girl. While Jesus holds himself together under questioning, Peter cracks under his. Not once, not twice, but famously 3 times. Verse 56, a servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. Then verse 58, a little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are also one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. And then verse 59, about an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And then there's the realization and the conviction at what he has done. Just as he was speaking, the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the cock crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. Here is a man who realizes he's got it wrong and turns back. Just as Jesus had said back earlier in the chapter in verses 31 and 32, Jesus says to Simon Peter, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." Jesus knows what's coming for Peter, but Jesus has prayed for Peter that his faith may not fail. It is Jesus who holds Peter. Just as the song goes, "When I fear my faith will fail, Christ will hold me fast." And finally, I wonder if you notice the small but very striking detail that only Luke records in verse 61. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. I wonder what that look from Jesus was like. I remember being challenged in a talk many years ago about this verse and being told that what you think Jesus' look was like can shape your understanding of the gospel. Was it a look of disappointment, a shaking of the head, condemnation, or a look of grace, a reassurance? It's okay, Peter. There's a saying, if looks could kill, in one sense, here is a look that killed. But it didn't kill Peter. Jesus is the one who dies in Peter's place. Peter's denial is put on Jesus' shoulders, and Peter turns back. It is wonderful forgiveness. It is wonderful grace.
We continue reading from verse 63. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. At daybreak, the council of elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Messiah," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." But they insisted, "He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here." On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at this time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave no answer. Then the chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, "You have brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us, as you can see. He has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him." But the crowd shouted, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us." Barabbas had been thrown into prison for insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the third time he spoke to them. "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I will have him punished and then release him." But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and he surrendered Jesus to their will.
I wonder if you notice the vast number of different people who are involved in this section. The guards, verse 63, the council of elders, verse 66, Pilate, 23, verse 1, Herod, verse 7, Herod's soldiers, verse 11, The whole crowd, verse 18. Barabbas, verse 19. The whole spectrum of religious and political sphere involved in deciding Jesus' fate. The Jewish leaders have heard enough, and yet they know that to get the desired death penalty, they know they need to get the Roman courts on side. The Jewish and Roman authorities, at times enemies of each other, now uniting to get rid of this man. 3 accusations the Jewish leaders give to Pilate in verse 2 of chapter 23. They say he's against the nation, he doesn't pay his taxes to Caesar, and he claims to be a king. And it seems to be this third one that pricks Pilate's interest, a king. And yet we're told first Pilate and then Herod cannot find anything wrong with this man. 4 times we're told Jesus is innocent. Verse 4, verse 14, verse 15 for Herod, verse 22. And yet when faced with the crowds, they're having none of it. 3 times the crowds shout over Pilate in verse 18, in verse 21, and in verse 23. Until finally the crowds win. Verse 23, they demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. Even though Pilate knows Jesus' innocence, he even offers to punish him in some way before releasing him. And then he offers the crowds a deal. Jesus, this man who I can find no wrong, or Barabbas, a murderer. Maybe Pilate thinks that the crowd will see sense and choose the right person. No one wants a murderer back on the streets with them. But he underestimates how much they want Jesus gone. The crowd would prefer to have a murderer live among them rather than the Son of God himself. And so, verse 25, he released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and they surrendered Jesus to their will. Here is a dramatic picture of what Jesus is about to do for humanity on the cross. Barabbas, the guilty one, goes free, whilst Jesus, the innocent one, is treated like a criminal. Jesus bears the guilt and the shame and the curse and the disgrace and the death that Barabbas deserved, whilst Barabbas received the release and the freedom and the life that Jesus deserved. Jesus goes to his death. Barabbas, the murderer, is free. In one sense, it's scandalous. But here is a picture of the gospel. Jesus gets what we deserve. We get what Jesus deserves. It's a wonderful substitution that offers forgiveness to all people. As captured in the hymn, "To God be the glory," the vilest offender who truly believes, that moment from Jesus, a pardon receives. It is a wonderful substitution. It is wonderful, wonderful grace.
Luke 23, verse 26. As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way to the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. And they divided up the clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, he saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was a written notice above him which read, this is the king of the Jews. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly for what we are getting, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise.
Luke doesn't give us many details about Jesus' actual crucifixion, just one verse, verse 33. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. One of the most barbaric forms of execution ever devised, reserved for the worst of criminals, eventually outlawed for being too cruel. The victim nailed to a cross of wood, a slow and excruciating death. And yet Luke points to the people and the events and the exchanges around the cross. He highlights the mocking, verse 35, the people stood watching and the rulers even sneered at him. Verse 36, the soldiers also came up and mocked him. Verse 39, one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. And yet throughout, Luke gives us the hints, well, strong hints, of exactly who this person is. Verse 35, let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one. Verse 37, the mocking, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. And then we're told immediately after, the sign says, this is the king of the Jews. Verse 39 from the criminals, aren't you the Messiah? And Luke focuses in on the wonderful exchange between Jesus and the second criminal, who first rebukes his fellow criminal, pointing out the great injustice at what is going on here. Verse 40, the other criminal rebuked him, don't you fear God, since we are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. And then he turns to Jesus with an immense plea for mercy and shows remarkable faith in his request. Verse 42, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And then we get some of the sweetest words in the whole of the Bible. Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Here is hope in the midst of the darkness. As the Son of God is being killed, still he is interested in others, holding out the offer of paradise for this criminal. Paradise. And what makes paradise? or that he will be with Jesus. Could Jesus have saved himself like the mocking calls? Well, of course Jesus could have saved himself. But if Jesus had saved himself, there would be no paradise for the criminal, or for anyone else for that matter. Jesus didn't save himself because he came to save others. Jesus didn't save himself in order to save others.
Luke chapter 23, verse 44. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, "Surely this was a righteous man." When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all those who knew him, including the woman who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things.
As we reach Jesus' final moments, Luke highlights a number of events and shows the significance of what is happening as the Son of God breathes his last. First, we're told there's darkness, verse 44. It was about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. For 3 hours, darkness reigns, as Jesus put it earlier in chapter 22, verse 53. Darkness throughout the Bible has signaled God's judgment, or God's absence, and therefore evil. And so here, as darkness reigns, there is judgment. But it's not falling on the soldiers who kill Jesus, or the chief priests and the elders who hand Jesus over, or the crowds who mock Jesus. Notice the darkness finishes as Jesus breathes his last, because the darkness falls on Jesus. The anger, the wrath, the judgment of God that should fall on every single person for the way they've treated him, that darkness descends on Jesus. And at that moment, we're told, second half of verse 45, the curtain of the temple was torn in two. The curtain found at the center of the temple, separating humanity from the place where God was said to dwell, separating sinful humanity from a holy, perfect God, is torn in two. As Jesus, the spotless Lamb of God, dies in the place of sinful humanity, so the dividing wall is torn down. So we have access to the Father, because judgment has fallen on another. And so we're told that there is someone there seeing everything that happened and comes to the conclusion that this was in fact a righteous man, and so praises God. A centurion, a hardened Roman soldier, who will likely have been responsible for many crucifixions, yet sees that this one is different. This man is different. But the final people that Luke highlights are the women. I've heard Luke's gospel described as the gospel for the marginalized, or the gospel for the outsider. In Jesus' day, women were outsiders. And yet for Luke and for Jesus, women were insiders just as much as men. It's women who we're told in Luke chapter 8 were supporting Jesus through his ministry out of their own means. It's women who are now here at the foot of the cross as Jesus dies. It's women who, we're told later, witnessed the tomb where Jesus was laid and then went home to prepare the spices and the perfumes, verses 55 and 56. And it's women who were first there to the tomb. For the moment, it's Good Friday, but Sunday is coming.